generally it's the desire to impose one's opinion on anyone else. But within the Muslim context, we have to accept there is such a thing as extremism. We're calling it Islamism, and that in one sentence can be defined as the desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society by law.
How does it manifest itself?
Well, the desire to impose Islam over society by law, according to one's interpretation, can manifest itself in cases like we saw in Sudan just this month, where a lady was sentenced for blasphemy, for apostasy.
Let's talk about this country.
Well, in this country, it's segregation in public institutions, Sharia patrols walking around in what they have labelled as Muslim areas. It can define itself in all forms of honour killings, FGM. People that interpret the religion, it's not the religion itself. It's an extreme or perverted interpretation of the religion.
Would you accept that definition of extremism?
I think it's an important fact that you mentioned, Jeremy, because this definition has never been actually set by the government, and it's very flexible. And that's what causes problems for schools, because on the one hand we're told to fight extremism and prevent extremism, but we're not told actually what it is. And I think you'll find that most Muslims within the community are actually anti-extremist as well, because they don't see what they do as being extremism.
Do you think the government's getting it wrong?
I think that using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, this reaction and response to what is, after all, an anonymous letter which has been denounced as a fake by most people, and to come in like this with anti-terror and counter-terrorism, so that everything that the Muslims are doing these days, including education, is seen through the lens of terrorism and security.
We've got to accept, though, in our communities that there's a challenge that we face, that yes, the vast majority of Muslims aren't violent, but we do have to deal with that vocal minority who have come to dominate the discourse of our communities, who promote, for example, in an ideal state, they want homosexuals to be killed. They promote adulterers and adulteresses to be stoned to death. In an ideal state, they'd call for the amputation of the hand of the thief. And they believe in these things in principle and are calling for them. And then they build what I call the mood music to which suicide bombers dance. There's a reason why we currently have about 400 British-born and raised citizens fighting for groups far more extreme than Al-Qaeda in Syria.
It's
not an easy thing to leave your country and be prepared to die.
That's another thing. I mean, the British government nearly went to fight in Syria, but the point is that none of this...
No, but they didn't join a group more extreme than Al-Qaeda, did they?
But none of this, Jeremy,
this group is beheading members of Al-Qaeda.
Okay, we're getting off the point.
None of this is taught in schools. I'm confident that none of this is taught in schools. It comes from wider community, it comes from other influences. But in schools, I've yet to meet, in 30 years of working in education, in Muslim schools and in schools with majority Muslim kids, I've yet to come across any teachers...
Would you like to live in a Sharia state?
It depends where it is. I've been in
you wouldn't like
states.
this country to become a Sharia state?
I don't think it would.
Would you like it to be?
Obviously, I would like to live under Sharia.
And in that, you would condone stoning of adulterers, for example?
No, not necessarily. It's a far bigger issue, Jeremy, than this. You cannot just pick and choose bits and bobs of the Sharia. It's a very broad issue. The social strata, the circumstances have to be
So what if the Sharia conditions? What if the Sharia conditions for stoning were met?
This has nothing to do with the education. Let's look at the education.
No, but that's what's being taught in the schools. So if the Sharia
schools.
conditions for stoning the adulterer were met,
being taught in schools.
Then is that something in principle we should condone?
It's not being taught in schools.
Do you have any evidence it's being taught in schools?
So I've been called personally by the teachers. Now I'm not going to comment on the Ofsted report because we've got to wait till the report comes out. So we've got to be careful here because these allegations are allegations.
Any evidence that this is being taught in schools? You do.
Evidence from the teachers who have called Quilliam directly. However, I don't want to conclude from that evidence. Evidence doesn't mean conclusions, it just means evidence.
We're not talking specific schools
here. We have to wait for the Ofsted report, but there is a broader issue that we must recognise. Extremism in this country, among Muslims and also among the far right, is a challenge. Symbiotically, they feed into each other. It's a challenge we have to confront. If we cannot sit on Newsnight and openly say that in principle, we don't condone the stoning of adulterers or the chopping of the hands if Sharia conditions are met anywhere in the world, then we've got a problem. Because I would condemn that in principle.
This is not what we were here to discuss.
Presumably, don't you? You do condemn the amputation of hands and the stoning to death.
If it's not according to a due process of law in any situation,
So if it's by due process, it's okay to stone people to death?
But the fact is that these things are not taught in schools.
No, Ibrahim, sorry.
I've worked in schools
is
for
it
30
okay
years.
to stone people to death by due process?
This thing is not taught in schools,
right.
And that's what we're here to discuss.
Now, you say you have evidence that some extreme views are being
Which is not a conclusion.
No, absolutely, I understand that. Is there any evidence that promoting extreme views in schools actually leads to extreme action later of the kind you've already alluded to once?
So we've got to treat this debate like racism. It's a no-brainer that if racism spreads in society, violent racism can emerge from it. Now, we can try and test that scientifically, but most people would accept that racism spreading in society, even if it doesn't lead to violence, is a bad thing. Likewise with homophobia. If non-violent extremism, like racism and homophobia, from a Muslim context, things like not being able to condone stoning people to death, if these ideas spread through society, it cannot be good for social cohesion, whether we can empirically
That's a fair
test it or
point,
not.
isn't it?
But what we're looking at here is that in schools it doesn't happen. This comes from the internet, there's all sorts of things.
Look, you heard him say
that
he's had letters from teachers. The government's worried enough to be mounting investigations.
We were talking just earlier, Maajid and I, about disgruntled people who lose their jobs for some sort of reason. They can become vexatious complainants against schools, and it's very easy to do that these days. The fact is that schools generally are there to educate the children to get good exam results. The schools in Birmingham,
You
which
can't
are under,
vouch for every school in this country any more than anyone else can.
the schools in Birmingham, which is the focus of this Trojan horse thing, Jeremy, have gone to outstanding, and they've got outstanding
Ibrahim,
exam results, and all of a sudden,
I have a son who's 13.
If you're not going to let me
school.
talk, please, Maajid.
No,
Please,
I'm
you've
asking
had your
you,
chance to
I'm pleading with you for the sake of my son who's
Let me
13,
talk.
who's in a Muslim-only school that I have no choice over because I don't live with him. If his teacher is unable to condemn stoning in principle or chopping off the hand in principle, I worry for the future of my son. Please set an example as an educationalist and come out and say that you stand for human rights and values, liberal values.
You're right to worry, because these things should have no place in school, because children don't understand these things. You know as well as I do.
But you can't
that is,
condemn on
you
national
know
television.
as well as I do that it's a very, very complex issue. It is not black and white. And it's what Crispin Blunt mentioned this morning, that when things are put into a black and white situation, those who are in the grey area